final report in the investigation of the Divine Mercy devotion according to Sister Faustina, penned by Pope Leo XIII, is the worst kind of heretic is the one who, while teaching mostly true Catholic doctrine, add a word of heresy like a drop of poison in a cup of water.
The history of Poland, more specifically honing into certain aspects of this nation's history that often does not get discussed, pertaining to the revolutions that happened, some of the early history of this country, and particularly a fascinating intellectual movement known as Polish Messianism, which clearly has some links to this Divine Mercy devotion. So first we start at the beginning of Poland, which begins with the conversion of this country. Their Duke ends up becoming baptized. He joins the church, and as was the custom of that time, the people would end up becoming baptized right after a leader who converted to the faith. And so this is really the moment that Poland joins the church in the year 966. But the thing is that Poland is a bit like a frontier state. They start to become more developed. They start to they have this link to the West through the church. But the thing is that they're surrounded by all these pagan tribes. And they're really the only Catholic country where they are in Europe. And this becomes a bit of an issue, to the point where they invite some crusaders, a German order of crusaders known as the Teutonic Order, that originally formed in Jerusalem, to come and help out with this issue, because they were having all these issues with raids from pagan tribes, and there were issues with missionaries being killed, missionaries who weren't necessarily working directly with the Polish government, but were sent by the church in this region, thinking of really here of Prussia, which is now divided between Poland and the Kaliningrad Oblast of Russia, but even the Baltics. We're going to see a map of that to help you all better visualize that. And the thing is that there's this tendency in history to make it seem as if the Teutonic Order and Poland were always enemies, they were always adversaries. This isn't really true. In the early years of the orders coming into to Prussia to set up the state of the Teutonic Order, they were actually supported by Polish and German nobility alike. And the thing is that although there were political issues with the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II and the Pope, both these factions supported the Teutonic Order at the time, to the point that, particularly with the Holy Father at the time, it's Innocent IV, if memory serves me right, who granted the order permission to offer a crusade without the crusade indulgence without his explicit permission, because he really saw it as needed. That's how needed this was, because this was the frontier of Christendom. Eastern Europe at this time, we're looking again towards this eastern region of Poland, the Baltics, a bit of what's now Belarus, for example. This is like the Wild West of Europe, basically. There's not a lot of development there. There's a lot of just land with these nomadic tribes that are constantly fighting and killing each other, who are pagan. And there were also issues with pagans selling Christians into slavery. So the Poles, and as well as the Holy Father and really the rest of Christendom, did not like that. But the point is that the order comes in, they set up their state with the help of Poland. And here we have a picture of, they aren't fighting the pagan tribes of mentioning, who were mostly in the region, the Prussian region, but also the Lithuanians, who become a more significant people later on. These are actually Mongols they're fighting in this image. There were wars where the Teutonic Order fought side by side with Poland against, at least in this case, with Mongols, with enemy invaders. Important to note. And something to hone in on here is that the Teutonic Order had a bit of a devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, actually a strong devotion to Our Lady. A lot of their settlements were named after Mary. For example, their headquarters, Marienburg Castle. Another settlement of theirs was called Marienwerder. And so they engaged this crusade with the idea that they were conquering this pagan land here and settling it and civilizing in the name of Our Lady. And the thing is, Terra Mariana is actually a title that was given to the Baltic region, originally by Bishop Albert of Riga, which is right here, some years before the Teutonic Order came in, if memory serves me right. He said that, it's reported that he said to Pope Innocent III, Holy Father, as you have not ceased to cherish the Holy Land of Jerusalem, the country of the Sun, so also you not to abandon Livonia, which is this region, the land of the Mother. So, little interesting aside here to keep in mind with this region. And in 1387, Lithuania converts to the faith, joins the church. And this is really a big deal because they were the last pagan nation in Europe. This is actually an image in a French church which shows the conversion of the last pagan nations in Europe. And you see Lithuania right here, represented by this individuals at the very end. And Poland comes a little bit earlier. And this conversion was influenced by the close political union that was formed between Poland and Lithuania. Essentially, what happens is that the Grand Duke of Lithuania agrees to become baptized on the condition that he is able to marry Princess Jadwiga of Poland. So this creates a very interesting rift between the Teutonic Order, which had been originally invited by the Poles to come in and fight the pagans, and the Poles themselves. The Teutonic Order see this conversion as a fake conversion. I know today it's not fashionable to question when people, if people are genuine in their conversion, but at this time this was a very legitimate thing because the order had faced issues with pagan tribes converting, but then, say a few months later, renouncing their conversion, renouncing their baptism, and saying, "Well, that wasn't a real baptism. We're going back to paganism," to justify fighting against the order and going back to their old ways of selling Christians into slavery and this sort of thing. And so they had a bit of experience with things like this, and they felt that this conversion was just done for political reasons. And they even, it's said that they even sent delegates to Rome to bring this up. So the Teutonic Order still would end up fighting Lithuania even after their conversion, and the Poles take Lithuania under their wing. And the Poles in general, they see the Teutonic Order as a bit of a nuisance. They have all this valuable land on the Baltic coast, and they invited them to come in and seize this land and Christianize it, but now they want them out. Their mission has ended officially, so now it is their time to go from the perspective of Poland, whereas the order felt that they had a right to this land because how many of their brothers had died fighting to Christianize this land and civilize it. So both sides had valid arguments in all of this, but unfortunately, this issue could not be resolved peacefully, and a series of wars end up ensuing between these Catholic nations. Um, and keep in mind, this is really the beginning of the German-Polish rivalry that we're led to believe really started before World War II, but goes back all the way to this point in history, the late Middle Ages. And it's something that we're going to see throughout this presentation. And perhaps one of the, well, really, perhaps the most significant event of these wars between Poland and Lithuania and the Teutonic Order is this battle, the Battle of Grunwald. This is actually a very famous Polish painting celebrating the battle. And this is considered one of the biggest, largest battles of the Middle Ages. I mean, you can see the numbers here. You got 39,000 men for Poland and Lithuania, and the order had about 27,000 men. These are high estimates, but they are accepted as legitimate by many historians here in the West. We don't know the exact amounts because we have all these different accounts of the battle that give us different numbers, and which makes determining the exact number difficult. But the important thing is that this ends up being a very crushing victory for Poland, and this ensures that the Poles become the dominant power in this area, while at the same time the order declines and basically becomes a rump state, a very weak country. They end up becoming a fief, or basically a vassal of Poland, about 56 years later. Yes, in 1466. And it's important to note that this battle is still celebrated by Poles today. It's seen as that big of a victory, and in part, jumping ahead a bit to World War I, but the victory of Austria-Hungary and Germany at Tannenberg. The reason why they gave it the name of Tannenberg is because Tannenberg has this association with Grunwald, and so it's seen as avenging the loss, going all the way back in the Middle Ages of Germans fighting Slavic people, basically. So you see it's still, people still were considering this battle relevant all those years later. Okay, and the next phase in Polish history. Also, it's important to note a bit earlier in Polish history, and I believe around this time as well, it's actually Warsaw is not the capital of Poland, it's Krakow, which becomes important a bit later, and concerning other aspects other speakers will bring up, I want you to keep that in mind about the relevance of Krakow and the Polish mindset, and also Vilnius, which was the capital of Lithuania. So what happens is that in 1569 there is this union that officializes the joining of Lithuania and Poland into one country, even though before they had been ruled by the same leader, basically by the King of Poland. And this is quite important because the Commonwealth becomes this very significant European power. I mean, you can see the map right here, and I'll show a map of the borders overlaid over modern countries, over modern Europe's borders, so you get a better idea of the scale of the nation we're talking about. One moment. And they have a very interesting system of government. They really modeled their nation after the ideals of Republican Rome. For example, they have this body in their government called the Sejm. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. I'm not Polish. My apologies. But basically, this system is like a senate, basically. Um, and their idea of the golden liberty, which I have up there, basically their concept is their king functions like a president, and their state is a republic under this president, which is their king. So it's certainly a very unique form of government, which the countries around it did not share. And the issue is that this system of government, um, for varying reasons, it faces internal problems that made it vulnerable to eventually being dismembered by outsiders. Um, you have certain revolts within Poland, like Poland-Lithuania, like the Cossacks revolt in 1648, for example, things that weaken this country. Although for a time it was like a hegemon in this region. It's also during this era that you have the famous uh, intervention of Jan Sobieski um, in defeating the Ottoman Turks from taking Vienna all the way down there in Austria. Um, so this was really a big era, a very proud era for Poland. But eventually it gets it goes under. But yes, this is the Commonwealth overlaid on modern European borders. As you can see, a very big country, um, especially for its time. And it had very powerful neighbors such as Russia. And so, I mean, even they've even fought quite a few wars against Russia and won, held their own. Um, so the Poles start to develop a certain pride about themselves that carries into the future. But then you have the partitions of Poland. And what happens is that due to those internal issues I was mentioning in the last slide, um, the neighbors of the Commonwealth, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, they decide to intervene in a series of 3 different partitions to restore order to this country, which really means just take their territory and divide it amongst themselves. And this is a grave humiliation for Poland. Um, and you know, it's really you have to put this in perspective. Um, this proud nation that had been around for generations. I mean, it has its roots in the Middle Ages and was really the first Catholic state in its part of Europe. All of a sudden, it's torn down in just a series of these partitions, technically not even official wars. Um, they just get dismembered. Um, and all of a sudden now they're being ruled by people that once they were equals to on the world stage. So this is just a major humiliation for them. And this is actually a painting in a church in Poland that portrays this event, the significance of this event. As you can see here, you have a lot of emotional imagery, right? You even have angels here crying, weeping over this woman here who represents this woman with brown hair represents Poland. You even have Our Lady here, who seems to be about a bit of a loss, looking up. So you know, you have priests here stretching out their arms. Yeah, a lot of emotion, a lot of um, mourning, essentially, over the death of this country. But things start to change in the favor of Poland, or at least for certain groups of Poles, with the establishment of the Duchy of Warsaw. Um, and Napoleon comes in uh, and sets up this duchy as a bit of a reward to his Polish troops and supporters. There had been Poles fighting for the French since the 1790s, around the time that their country gets dismembered for the last time in that series. You have all these emigres that leave Poland and go to other countries, particularly France, and try to form little communities there and advocate for other countries to come in and liberate Poland. And Napoleon becomes the first one to really take them up on this offer. And as you could see here, this was the duchy as it was established in 1807, and this is these are the 1812 borders for the famous invasion of Russia by Napoleon. And the thing is, this act of liberating Poland, even though technically this country that gets liberated is not called Poland, it's called the Duchy of Warsaw. This is seen as this great move by Napoleon, by Polish nationalists. Polish nationalists are going to develop a huge affinity for Poland. I mean, sorry, a huge affinity for Napoleon going forward. Even though they didn't really get everything they wanted. For example, their borders didn't get restored to everything they had before. This gentleman over here becomes their king. And it's important because the name of this gentleman is Frederick Augustus, who was actually the king of Saxony, so they have a German ruling over them instead of a Polish noble. So there's certain things the Polish nationalists are not satisfied by, but overall, this is a breath of fresh air for them. But that comes to an end with the fall of Napoleon, and what happens is that the Congress of Vienna draws up new borders for Poland, which you can see here. And as with the initial collapse of Poland, as I was referring to over, you have a wave of Poles leaving the country again, going to other parts of Europe and forming these nationalist communities. And this becomes a consistent pattern, as we're going to see going forward. Whenever there is an event in Polish history where you have some kind of revolt, or in this case, a partition, you have people who stay and then you have people who leave. And particularly with the nationalists, this is quite important because they end up using their position in other countries to advocate for foreign support and get things written in newspapers about the plight of their people, so on and so on. But Polish nationalists end up rising up. They don't take this one sitting down as it were. Eventually, they build up enough courage to start a revolution against, in this case, within Russian Poland, or what's referred to as Congress Poland. And you have Poles here storming the arsenal, basically, to get the firearms, and you have these very dramatic images here, these battles. But what happens is that the Russians do end up taking advantage of basically this lack of coordination among the revolutionaries and their overall superiority in their numbers, and just crush the revolt and introduce a harsh series of repressions. But the nationalists don't give up. And something I mentioned here as well is that part of what provoked this uprising is that Alexander I, who was Tsar at the time of Russia, he agreed to certain things at the Congress of Vienna, but then went back on them regarding Poland. Like, for example, he agreed that he would allow liberty of the press within Poland at Vienna, but then after the Congress of Vienna, he introduces censorship laws that the nationalists did not like, and so this was seen as very much a very tyrannical gesture, basically, and this incensed them to want to rise up. And what's very important is that after this uprising, you have a new intellectual movement that starts to emerge in Poland. After all these defeats, this kind of a roller coaster that their country goes through or has gone through the past 40 years, from the partitions to Napoleon to this uprising, helps to give birth, as well as you have influence from the so-called Enlightenment. It gives birth to this new wave of thought. And you see here, I put it as 1831 because this is when the term was coined. And this was a philosophical and religious movement that held that Poland was the Christ of Europe. And this is actually a quote taken from a very interesting article on this subject. And so what you have is that you have Poles equating what happened to our Lord with the situation of their country. And specifically, this is a quote I'm pulling from this article: the suffering, chosenness, and mission of the Polish nation. People believed in the complete similarity of the situation of Christ in Poland. Golgotha was the condition of the resurrection. The martyrology of the Poles has the same end. It will lead to a new life. And so you have this concept, essentially, of the current division of Poland by these different countries and the kind of statelessness of their people. That is their Golgotha, right? But you have these writers basically prophesizing of this great time ahead where Poland will rise again on its own third day and will actually free the peoples of Europe. They won't just free the Poles, they won't just free themselves, but they're going to free everyone in Europe and defeat slavery everywhere. We're going to see more of this kind of language. But it's interesting because at the same time, you have a lot of young men becoming quite involved with the church in Poland at this time. But the thing is this author talks about we have to kind of question the motives a little bit, because, as he says, faith was so strongly linked with patriotic feelings that sometimes it was difficult to distinguish what was the goal and what was the means. And this is not to say that patriotism in of itself is not bad, but as we're going to see in the next few slides, this version of patriotism is a perversion of authentic patriotism, of authentic Catholic nationalism. It is basically trying to put this nation of Poland on the same level as the Catholic Church and trying to say that it's synonymous with the Church. Okay, and this gentleman right here, Adam right here, he is actually acknowledged as one of the leading, actually the leading romanticist of Poland at this time. Very famous writer within this country. And he has certain things to say about this. He contributes his own thoughts in this book he writes called The Pilgrimage of the Polish Nation, 1832. I'm just going to read out these quotes. And on the third day, the soul will return to the body, and the nation will rise up from the dead and liberate all the peoples of Europe from captivity. And just as bloody sacrifices on earth came to an end with the resurrection of Christ, so wars in Christianity will cease with the resurrection of the Polish nation. And this is another excerpt. And Poland said, whosoever will come to me shall be free and equal, for I am freedom. But the kings, when they heard it, were frightened in their hearts, and they crucified the Polish nation and laid it in its grave, crying out, we have slain and buried freedom. But they cried out foolishly, for the Polish nation did not die. Its body lieth in the grave, but its spirit has descended into the abyss, that is, into the private lives of people who suffer slavery in their own country. For on the third day, the soul shall return to the body, and the nation shall arise and free all the peoples of Europe from slavery. So essentially what you have going on here is intellectuals like this gentleman are reading into the New Testament during this time of great suffering for the Polish people, this great demoralization, repression, and they're reading certain things into the New Testament, and they're essentially they're doing precisely what St. Peter warns us about in one of his epistles, where he says that those who interpret the scriptures to their own devices, they bring ruin to their souls. Basically, I'm paraphrasing. And this is precisely what these gentlemen were doing. And I have the example of another writer who takes it a bit further. We're just going to call him Andre for the sake of this presentation. He was a Polish refugee from Vilnius who lived in Paris. And he actually claims to have a private revelation. He receives a vision, allegedly, from Our Lady and a special inspiration from the Holy Ghost, who told him that basically he's the herald of this apocalypse that's coming very soon. He should be preaching the end of time and the power of divine grace. And essentially in this unraveling of basically the end of the world, that the Poles, the Jews, and the French were to play leading roles in this process. And what's interesting is that he actually believed that Napoleon would be somehow involved with this process, even though Napoleon had been dead by this point. He experiences these visions in 1839, but Napoleon had already been dead for a few years by this time. But this actually, this belief of Napoleon, basically, his pro-Napoleon sentiments, actually that's what gets him kicked out of France, because this is right after the restoration of the Bourbons. And actually, this is another point to bring up about this movement. That, we're going a bit further into history, but just to show you the long-term influence of writers such as the two gentlemen I have referenced here. After the election of John Paul II, J. Sawaki's verse, "Amidst quarrels God will strike," enjoyed great popularity in Poland. The work, which was written in 1848, predicted an open throne for a quote-unquote Slavic Pope. Which so that's an example of, oh, look, this prophecy of one of our great writers got fulfilled, right? And specifically with this Slavic Pope idea that this writer had, he also held that this Slavic Pope was going to help restore the world, and basically, that he was going to help bring about this era of peace and whatnot, and all this stuff. And that quote I just read, it's from the article I just referenced in the last slide. And what's important is to note as well is that going forward, this movement actually does have an influence on the Mariavites. The thing is that with the Messianists, the idea of a suffering nation was compared to the sacrifice of Jesus that would bring about ultimate redemption in a new era in the history of humanity. These ideas were subsequently taken by the Mariavites, who built their identity around them, right? So they're taking these ideas that were religious, but also more so political in nature, that were very idealistic in nature, and the Mariavites, in some way, they actually they basically pervert them even further and apply on a more religious level, because they hold that their little mother is basically she's actually the third Eve, and the bishop who leads their order is the third Adam, right? So it's this concept of God choosing the Polish nation specifically to basically help bring about this redemption of the world, this further redemption of humanity, or kind of like a repeat of what happened with our Lord, basically, using Poland to allowing Poland to suffer this great suffering, but only so that a greater grace will become available, basically, because of this suffering. That Poland will dispense all this grace to the world, so to speak. And as I noted here, although the diary nor the devotion itself explicitly promote Polish nationalism, the kind of Polish nationalism we were seeing before, this false nationalism, there are some startling connections. For example, Christ choosing Poland, specifically Poland, to bring about this spiritual renewal. And that's going to not just stay within Poland, but it's going to go internationally, right? But also this special nature, this character of Polish suffering, as being this prerequisite for this special mission of Poland. And two images I have here. Certainly, this was quite startling when I first discovered this. But if you put the Polish flag, which the modern Polish flag is based on, it's very closely patterned after the Duchy of Warsaw flag, that was used under that regime. But if you just compare that side by side with the rays shooting out from the void where the Sacred Heart should be in the Divine Mercy image, you see white, white, red, red, in the same pattern, shooting right out towards you. It's quite poetic in a sense, really. Moving on. Okay, and going a bit further, you have these uprisings in what's known as Greater Poland. This is actually in the Prussian part of Poland, Prussia being this forerunner state to what's now referred to as Germany. And you have two uprisings, but I group them here together because they're close enough in time period that it warrants that. And these are they're very insignificant, rather, very insignificant uprisings for the most part. They tried to restore Poland, but failed. But what's much more important is an uprising that comes after it by 20 or so years. You have the January uprising, and this takes place much like with the November uprising within Prussian Poland. And this was aimed at restoring the Commonwealth. This lasted the longest of the rebellions and was very much immense in its scale, enjoyed a lot of, they had a lot of cells operating throughout what was once Poland-Lithuania, fighting this war against the Russians. And it drums up a lot of sympathy across Europe and even America, in part due to that emigre population I was mentioning earlier. So you have some suspicious aspects this government engages in, this provisional government. For example, they decree that all sons of Poland are free and equal citizens without distinction of creed, condition, or rank. A bit suspicious. I mean, one could try and argue, well, they did this for the sake of trying to get as many people as possible to join their revolution, and just so that they could look good in the eyes of all these foreign countries that accepted the errors of the French Revolution in Europe and, of course, America. But, of course, such a thing is not good in principle. It's also important to note, as one Polish historian noted on an interview you can find on YouTube, that at this time, the Polish provisional government was actually setting up seminaries and using seminaries, Catholic seminaries within Poland as fronts, basically, for their revolution. So in this way, they weren't really respecting the church. They were trying to use the church, as it were, as kind of a meat shield, basically, so to speak, between themselves and the Russians, basically. It's done with the aspect of, well, if they attack a seminary, they raid a seminary, that's going to look very bad to all the Catholic countries. It doesn't matter that, it may be justified because we're using seminaries, say, to store weapons, and we're using them as hideouts for our soldiers. This is going to look really bad for them because it's going to look like they're really persecuting the Catholic religion. That's not to say that the Tsarist government wasn't persecuting the Catholic faith before this uprising, after it, during it, because they absolutely were, unfortunately. This is where we're going to get into the next slide here. You do have Pope Blessed Pius IX, attempting to find a middle ground in this situation. This very public revolution, this very well-known revolution, it drums up a lot of attention. Of course, now the church has to respond to this situation. And he comes to the conclusion that the Russians should grant Poles autonomy and liberty to observe the faith, while the nationalists should respect the authority of the Russian government. And see there my citations of the specific decree. But sadly, both sides did not agree to this reconciliation. Something else of note is that you have this archbishop here, who was the Archbishop of Warsaw, Archbishop Wilinski, who was quote-unquote made a saint by John Paul II, actually took an active role in supporting this revolution against the Russian government. But this uprising does end up getting put down eventually by the Russian government, and as is their custom, they use incredibly harsh means of reprisal. For example, some of the things they did, they forcibly expelled Poles to Siberia. They seized land. They did a ton of public executions, and they persecuted the church very severely. So much so that by 1870, not a single Polish bishop remained in his own diocese. And this painting here actually is it's very symbolic. Basically, it's representing, you see here, a brown-haired woman representing Poland. The black, presumably she's wearing this as a sign of mourning for having been defeated. You know, again, it's meant to evoke a lot of emotion, right? And I believe here the blonde-haired woman who's standing right next to Poland is Lithuania, again symbolizing the very close relationship between these peoples, these nations. And here you have the Russians. Jumping forward into history, you have another revolution attempt in that starts out in the city of Lodz, which is like it's in the center of Poland, basically. And this is mostly a revolution that's enacted by or really initiated by the Socialists within Poland, and it spreads throughout other parts of Poland. Even after the initial revolt was crushed, what happened is that they essentially saw an opportunity with the humiliation of the Russo-Japanese War, and with a revolution within Russia that was going on at the same time against the Tsar, to basically take advantage of Russia's weakness to try and overthrow the government. Though there's a bit of disagreements about how this should be done, and in fact this helps to cause the failure of the revolt, because the different factions can't really agree about how the revolution should be led or coordinated. Well, example of this is that actually you have the leader of the Socialist Party at the time, Joseph Pilsudski, who becomes important a bit later in history. He was heavily involved in the coordinating and strategy of these revolutionary activities. And he causes a split within the Polish Socialist Party because he insists more on nationalism. He wants to blend nationalism, and he wants to get the, I guess, the more conservative factions, the more nationalist factions of Poland on his side by doing that. But in doing so, he loses the friendship of the international socialists, who want to who want to join their comrades in Russia in overthrowing the Tsar, right, and getting rid of that government. They don't really care so much about having an independent Poland. For them, it's more so about just getting rid of the monarchy. Whereas Pilsudski and his faction, they first and foremost are interested in securing the independence of Poland. And it's important to note that part of the reason why it's important to note that his faction gets a reputation for endorsing certain violent methods of violence and whatnot that the conservative factions did not like. And right here, you actually have this image is a related image. You have some some anarchists, some communists there, basically that partook in this revolt. And so the time does come for Poland to become an independent state, but this comes as a result of the very end of the First World War, thanks to the intervention of the Allies. One of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points called for a self-governing Poland. And Pilsudski has a bit of a turnaround. He became a marshal, and he served in the war. And he ends up becoming the first head of state of this new republic, the Second Polish Republic. And he ends up distancing himself from socialism. What happens is that the Soviets invade 1919, and it really looked like they were going to overrun the country and continue on to basically ravage and destroy the rest of Europe. But thankfully, they were beaten back by a brave Polish defense at Warsaw, and the Poles won. And these are the borders of the Polish nation before that victory. They end up acquiring all of this land after they defeat the Soviets in that war. And here's Pilsudski. It's also important to note that Pilsudski also it's alleged that he had ties to Freemasonry as well, similar to his position on socialism. We could kind of argue, was he really true in disavowing these positions, or was he just trying to be more moderate to look good, right? To seem more appealing to the average Pole? Don't know personally, but it's quite interesting because he's seen as someone who was this great anti-communist. But if you look, I mean, not even you look like 10 years earlier, he helps to lead this massive communist revolution within Poland. So it certainly raises some questions about his character. Okay, and going forward, you have Poland and their interwar relations with Germany. What's interesting to note is that before Hitler becomes the leader of Germany, there were actually problems between Poland and the Germans. For example, as H.E.B. Taylor records in his book, The Origins of the Second World War, in 1931, this is under the Weimar government, you have this cabinet member, Gottfried Reinhold Treverianus. He initiates this agitation at the Polish frontier, which raises tensions between the two countries. And this 1934, so a year after Hitler comes into power, Poland and the Germans sign a non-aggression pact. And Poland in 1939, actually during the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, is granted a small bit of territory around here. So like, right on the border, basically, a little bit of territory right on the border. that they wanted from the Czechs. It's interesting to note is that Taylor himself, he was not a man of the right at all, actually. He was in no way personally endorsing Hitler. But if you really read into what he says about the leading up to World War II, it's very fascinating, very eye-opening. He takes a very objective account. Of course, does he get everything right? No, but what's really interesting is that he states that Hitler did not really have an antagonism towards Poland personally. If anything, he wanted to he viewed them in a similar light to how he saw Italy as essentially this useful ally. But in particular, I pick out this quote because it really quite it illustrates the situation of Poland quite well at this time period, shortly before the Second World War in the year 1939. The Poles, regarded themselves as an independent great power and forgot that they had gained their independence in 1918 only because both Germany and Russia had been defeated. Now they had to choose between Germany and Russia. They chose neither. Only Danzig prevented cooperation between Germany and Poland, and that's on page 196 of the Origins of the Second World War. And so it just seems like at least with the Polish government, that they certainly had a bit of an ego to them. And you look at it from their perspective, they came back onto the world stage, they defeat the Soviet Union, and this, they become basically this, this great display of heroism, and they have this concept, right, that they should be a great power because, well, Poland-Lithuania was once a great power all those centuries ago. So in their eyes, Poland should have a similar role in the 20th century, which is why, as Taylor notes in that same book, Poland, he calls Poland a revisionist power, that they did not like the Treaty of Versailles because it didn't really allow them flexibility to become this great power that they wanted to become, even though they owed their independence to the intervention of the Allies at the end of the First World War. And so, just some important things to note about the war years in Poland. So their inability to choose between either Germany or the Soviet Union, yes, they do end up siding with Britain and France, but Britain and France aren't able to save them in September 1939. And what happens is that the nation is partitioned once more. And particularly to note, that's a little error there, my apologies. In 1940, you have the Katyn massacre. You have, I believe, about 20,000 Poles, prisoners of war, are executed by the Soviet Union. And the Soviets actually end up pinning this on the Germans. Retroactively, they end up blaming the Germans for this atrocity. And, well, Britain and the United States believe the Russians because, well, they were allies. They weren't going to believe the Germans who were saying the Russians are liars, they're liars. Look at our investigation that shows that the Russians did it. But you have during the war, Polish government is in exile in the United Kingdom under Premier Skorsky. He actually sides with the Soviet Union against Germany. So a little too little, too late in a way. Not only did they choose the very country that Our Lady warned us about all the way back in 1917 at Fatima to ally themselves with, but they didn't even do it in time to save their country from invasion. And it's important to note, it's quite interesting to read up on gentleman by the name of Ivan Maysky, who was the Soviet ambassador to the United Kingdom during the interwar years and during the Second World War, who was also Jewish as it happened. And he records these events in a very interesting manner. He says something like, that the Polish circles, the emigre circles, remember, that during the war, they were becoming more and more sympathetic to the idea that Poland should be ruled by the Soviet Union, because they were under the impression that if the Germans won the war, that the Germans would just exterminate all the Poles, but at least if the Soviet Union would win, it would be a Soviet Poland, but at least it would still be Poland. And he records that with glee, that finally the Poles are coming more and more on our side. Basically, they're no longer disapproving of this alliance that is going to be officialized between us and the United Kingdom. And so he is also there for the mediation of the Soviet-Polish Treaty, which basically confirms that Poland and Russia are officially allies, and this seals their fate as a Soviet puppet state in the future. It's also important to note, going forward with very end of the war with Krakow, one of the alleged miracles of the Divine Mercy image that was printed out in America in the newspapers that one of our fellow researchers dug up. There was this claim that the Divine Mercy image, the explicit veneration of it, displaying of it in public, had saved Krakow from being destroyed at the end of the war by the Germans. But the thing is that if one looks into the matter, the Germans did not have a plan to destroy Krakow. The worst they did was, as they were retreating, they blew up some bridges to kind of cut off the Russians from immediately catching up to them. And neither did the Soviet side actually want to destroy Krakow. So from either side, Krakow was not under threat of being destroyed at the end of the war. So that was just one example of misinformation being spread about this devotion, what it was allegedly doing in Poland at that time. Yes, so yeah, this is just page 1 of my sources, but this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
He was able to correlate the history of Poland, the Polish Messianism, and also the Polish revolutions, again correlating back to the Divine Mercy. So he'll be going into the background of key people behind this devotion, and also their theological history and the timeline of the development and spread of this devotion from Poland into the United States, and from the United States worldwide.
For my presentation, I'm going to go into a bit of background about some of the key people, and then we'll go into a timeline of the devotion. And I think probably a lot of people in the chat are actually, they have done their own research on Divine Mercy from specifically Sister Faustina's diary. I think what gets missed in the investigations has been the behaviors and beliefs of the key people that helped to spread the devotion, because the main spreaders of the devotion, the official gatekeepers of the devotion, are the Marian Fathers of the Immaculate Conception. And so you'll see that they're quite key. And then we'll also see how the Divine Mercy attaches itself to the concept of Polish Messianism, with the idea of a crucified Poland and then a resurrection Poland. So going into the key people of the devotion, before Sister Faustina is born, there's quite a popular priest by the name of Honorak Kaminsky in in Poland. And so before he became a priest, he actually participated in the Polish Revolution in 1863. And then after he was imprisoned and he got out of prison, he entered the priesthood, and he was involved in creating over 25 secret religious orders in Poland. And he's a key spiritual director in a lot of in a lot of the people that would later on develop the Divine Mercy. And so what I've actually found with looking into these secret religious congregations is many, the religious congregations were being used for political purposes as either a background, as an underground government, to store, or as a military headquarters, as well as to do intelligence work as well too. And you can kind of understand how this would work, with the diaspora of the Polish diaspora, because a lot of the Polish intelligentsia had spread, had left Poland and was operating in England or France or America, and they were sort of operating an underground government from those cities. So one of the first people is that he was a spiritual director for was Maria Coswalt. I'll just say Maria Francisca. She was the foundress of the Mariavites in the town of Plock. And why that's important is that Sister Faustina's one convent that she entered into was actually in Plock, and it's probably less than a quarter of a mile down the road from the Mariavites. And she actually, the foundress of the Mariavites, she actually ended up having, she wrote a diary also called The Works of Great Mercy. So we have this theme popping up in England, in Poland, of a devotion to God's mercy. I won't go into too much of the details, but they end up seeing her as the equivalent to our Blessed Lady. And then also elevating her up into basically the Holy Spirit. And then they, as their movement moves on, they end up becoming quite more liberal. They attach themselves to a lot of Gnostic groups, and tangentially that connects them to some Freemasonry lodges. So now we get to the Marian Fathers of Immaculate Conception. So they were a very ancient order that goes back to the 1600s, but due to the persecution by the Russians, it's pretty much collapsed. So by the time you get to the early 1900s, there's only one priest left in the whole order that used to be hundreds. And so Father Honorak Kaminsky advises this Father George to secretly restart up the MIC. So at this, in the early 1900s, again, Russia's still controlling this area of Poland, and Poland's not an independent country. So again, it's another one of these secret congregations that are started up. And I should say that after the Mariavites were excommunicated in 1906, Father Honorak Kaminsky in 1908, he had all his congregations that he was leading taken away from him by the Polish bishops. So he's helping to start up, he's advising this Father George to start this up, while he's actually really deposed from being a spiritual advisor to people, to being able to sort of take on these starting up these congregations. He has a friend named Father Francis Busey. He would go on to become a significant spiritual general of the MIC, where it really starts to spread around the world. Well, mostly in America. And this is another key figure, another Marian father. So again, he was had Father Kosminski as a spiritual director, and we'll see him in the next slide how he fits into the devotion, because he ends up being quite a key key player. And then you probably will be familiar with some of the other people, the main people that we know about in the devotion. We have Father Michael Sapako. So he was the first spiritual confessor for Sister Faustina. And he did a lot of the initial writings of essays on the need for a feast of mercy in the church. And through Michael Sapako, he was roommates with this painter, Eugene Kazimierowski, who it turns out that he was a Freemason as well as an atheist. He seems to have quite a tragic background, which to me seems quite odd if this devotion is, if this image is really coming from God, that he meets such a tragic end, and that he allegedly commits suicide. And there's other parts to him as well too, that he, in his paintings, that he saw himself as a Judas Iscariot. So he would use himself to represent Judas Iscariot in some of his paintings, which, again, that's a little bit odd that an atheist was taking part in this, but he obviously saw it as, being an atheist, and atheists are quite anti-Christian, to be then wanting to take on a Judas Iscariot role to kind of mock the church. Then Sister Faustina has a second spiritual confessor in Krakow. So you basically have the devotion occurring in two main places. While there was Plock and Warsaw in the middle of Poland, you have Vilnius in the northeast, and then you have Krakow in the south. And Krakow is where Sister Faustina ends up passing away. And this is the connection to the previous people that we showed with Father Honorak Kaminsky in the previous slide, is that during World War II, Father Joseph Jarbowski meets Father Sapako, and he's the one that actually gets the devotion from Poland to America. And he travels around quite a bit dealing with the Polish diaspora, and we'll go into a little bit more detail in the timeline. You'll see it come together. Then another painting is painted in in Krakow. That's the second Divine Mercy painting, and that's the most popular painting by Adolf Hila. Without knowing Poland and just Polish, and just looking at the English websites and the best that I can get with translations, I can't find too much information on his background, other than he seems to be quite, part of the liberal intelligentsia at in interwar Poland at this time. And the first Divine Mercy image ends up getting lost in the confusion of the Soviet takeover after the war. And this priest here, this Father Joseph, he was also a roommate with Father Sapako. Not sure that he knew Eugene Kazimierowski personally, but after he was sent to Siberia and then he comes back to Poland, he would take up the cause to look for the first painting. So we'll see these people come up in the timeline, but this gives you a bit of a background of these people. There'll be some more information coming forward about them. So to start off the timeline, I think it's important to understand the holy offices and the Vatican's perception of devotions, of these private revelations. And I did find out in 1875, the Holy Office was receiving a lot of requests to review writings of people that were either having apparitions, or they were wanting feasts instituted, and they were using apparitions to spread feasts, and then they were teaching sort of a faulty theology through these devotions. So the Vatican puts out a warning back then to take very seriously the review of anything, and not to be too easygoing about allowing feasts, and that people just can't start making, priests and laity can't start having, private feasts on their own for a novel devotion. So 1893, under the spiritual direction of Honorak Kaminsky, he recommends that she starts writing down her visions, and then she would entitle her diary would become known as the Works of Great Mercy. And then again, I just point out that this was happening in the city of Plock, and Sister Faustina would spend her first years she would actually have her first revelations in the convent. That's a bit of a typo. That is less than a kilometer, and it's more like half a kilometer, or a quarter of a mile from the headquarters of the Mariavites. And then we move on to the beginning of the 20th century, and so, as I said, due to Russian persecutions, the Marian Fathers went from being a very symbolic of Polish pride to being reduced down to a single priest. When Sister Faustina is born, she gets born at a time when you have a lot of revolutionary ideas passing through Poland. Maybe not necessarily through the average local citizens that are still quite conservative, but definitely through the upper classes in Poland at the time. They're taking on socialist, Marxist, Freemasonic, liberal ideas. And then we have 1906 comes along, and the Vatican excommunicates the Mariavites. And the Mariavites, they end up, instead of just disappearing or just going on their own, they end up really starting to strengthen themselves, and they agree to having a communion with the Old Catholics that had rejected Vatican I. And eventually the government the Russian government starts to recognize the movement as a legitimate religion, and it's basically being used to divide the Poles to prevent nationalism. So you have you have people very attached to the Catholic Church for out of nationalism to reject Russia, to see it as symbolically opposing Russia. And then you also have this heretical Messianic sect as well, and they do grow up to having about 160,000 followers at its peak. And it wasn't a peaceful thing. You'll actually find in newspapers, in the newspaper archives, around this time, or in the 1920s, that they were attacking Catholic churches. So it wasn't just they went off kind of peacefully on their own. There was quite a lot of animosity between the Mariavites. And another point that'll be raised, and I think that the Chaplet of Divine Mercy takes a lot of inspiration from some other devotions, and so one is Sister Mary Martha Shambone. So she dies in 1907, and she has a diary, and her diary is about the holy wounds of our Lord. And so she comes up, she has a vision of that God providing with the mercy chaplet of the holy wounds, and she would have a diary that would be published, and then that would start to spread through Europe and over to English-speaking countries. And in the next slide, I'll show you just briefly some of the commonalities between it. But this devotion in the post-conciliar church, it's approved now, but it was actually banned in 1939 because there's already a devotion to the Holy Wounds of our Lord, which is the little chaplet of the 5 wounds of Jesus Christ by Saint Alphonsus Liguori. And you'll actually also find with the holy wounds of Sister Chambone's Mercy Chaplet and Sister Faustina's chaplet that they have quite a similar prayer to the prayer of Saint Gertrude in it as well too. So I've just noted out some commonalities. This comes from sort of a previous presentation that I did, but basically they're both called a mercy chaplet. They both use the Holy Rosary. Sister Faustina copies some prayers directly, and then I've also just highlighted yellow where things are quite similar. They have sort of the same rhythm. They come up with the same sort of the same request. If it's not the holy wounds, then it's the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ, and that's very similar to the prayers of Saint Gertrude. And I will say that the one thing with the 5 wounds of Jesus that Sister Chambon did that is similar to the chaplet of Saint Alphonsus Liguori is at every decade of that devotion, you're making a specific meditation on each wound. So each wound is attached to something that you're supposed to meditate on. So the left foot, the right foot, the left hand, the right hand, and the side wound. And it's interesting to note that despite Sister Faustina's chaplet offering up the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord, there's no meditations on any of the decades. So while it's copying the Rosary, using the Holy Rosary as a template, which I don't know how that seems to be concerning in itself, but that there's no real meditation. So you could kind of say that it becomes sort of a vain repetition if there's no meditation on what you're supposed to do. I did point out where there's some similarities in the promises of the Mercy Chaplet. I won't go through these. I mean, but it's just to say that Sister Faustina's Divine Mercy Chaplet isn't unique, and that similar ideas were already floating around, and the Holy Office banned them. So we moved from 1907 to 1908. As I said, Honorak Kaminsky has his congregations taken away from him; they can't lead them, and this is due to his connection to the Mariavites. But he also praises the leader of the Marian Fathers of the Immaculate Conception, that he'll be a leader of the ecumenical movement in Poland at the time, and we'll see some allusions to this. So again, this all happens. His reviving of the Marian Fathers, this all happens in secret, so there's this all comes from Blessed George's writings that he got this blessing from this last priest before he dies, and allegedly they get a constitution that's personally approved by Pope Pius X himself. Again, that's something we'd have to look into that more. There's nothing in the Acta Apostolica Sedis, the AAS, so there'd have to be something else. But we're basically saying that we're being told it's secretly approved, so it's just a word of mouth things. And he's considered a reformer that modernized the Marian Fathers. Some examples is that they took simple vows instead of solemn vows. They don't need to wear anything distinguishing them as priests and part of religious organization or religious order. Again, they're saying that this is because of they have to keep themselves underground due to the persecution by the Russians. And they also abandoned a tradition of always keeping on them a 1-decade rosary. So you basically have them looking like a complete a layman. There's nothing actually distinguishing them in their everyday life. And what you'll find is because of the Russian suppression, they don't actually stay very long in Poland. Let me just go back. They end up quickly relocating to Switzerland, to the Catholic University of Fribourg, and then they quickly expand to the United States. First to Washington, Chicago, and Detroit, and then now their headquarters, those aren't the big organizations anymore. Now their big headquarters is in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. So just to give you an example of looking into them, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I always think it's something to consider is to look into the money trail. And they, despite being being an underground organization and having to really wash themselves, someone seemed to be giving them, quite a bit of money early on, it seems like. That's not necessarily bad. I know Father St. Maximilian Kolbe, he got a large land grant from a Polish nobility, but it's something to consider when you're looking into someone's theology is who's supporting these these people. And so I just point out some of the things that I found is they're buying a house in Chicago, a new house in Chicago in 1921 for almost $500,000. In today's money, they could buy a 300-acre estate in Thompson Hill, Connecticut for $3.2 million. And this is at a time when there's about 300 religious members worldwide between essentially Poland and America. And then there's just some other examples here where the MIC priest is flying one of the first transatlantic flights, regularly, commercial flights across the Atlantic, for $8,000, which would be like priest, taking a Concorde, taking the first Concorde flight and, paying, something like $20,000 for the flight. It sort of just seems very, very extravagant. And again, it just points out, during the war, they're able to travel from what's supposed to be war-torn Europe to America on sort of a sightseeing trip, and you sort of wonder, in 1939, the priest is flying back to help out with the to help out with the Polish military as a chaplain, and then the superiors traveling on a sightseeing trip to America, and we'll see later that there is some connection to the Polish provisional government. And again, this is 1944 is when we get into Stockbridge, getting a large estate established in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And then also in England after the war, Father Joseph Jarbowski, who brought the devotion to America, when he goes to England, he's able to get a really prestigious estate for really cheap off of the British Army, because it was being used by the Polish Secret Service, and then he turns it into a Divine Mercy College that's used for children of supposed refugees and international diplomats. And when they say international diplomats, it sort of seems like then the refugees are probably not people just fleeing, poor people fleeing with their shirt on their back. It's a prestigious private college that's up in operations. So as I said, the two Marian fathers, they flee to the University of Fribourg, and quickly the students and faculty at Fribourg become very suspicious of these two priests from Poland, and eventually the Vatican gets wind of them, and Father Umberto Bendignini, head of this Sodalitium Pianum organization that was tasked with rooting out modernists in the church. He doesn't just have a list of modernists, but he puts Father George Methuselas as being the most dangerous modernist in the world. And this comes out of his own writings. And just as an example that I found is, he was a spiritual director for this liberal Catholic socialist woman in Poland, during the interwar period. And even in his own diary, he acknowledges that he's been accused of being an enemy of the church, a liberal, a socialist, and a communist. Now he could be embellishing this, that maybe he's not, and he's doing this, but there is they do recognize that they had a controversial beginning, but because we're in the post-conciliar era, they just kind of laugh off these claims as being just nothing more than than just hyperbole or personal vendettas, or just the church is just rigid and doesn't want to consider any other ideas. Another example of that's a bit concerning with the Marian Fathers is that one seminarian was dismissed from the from a seminary in 1907, after just 1 year, after it being discovered that he was a Mariavite. And in 1911, he ends up being welcomed into the Marian Fathers in Switzerland. So again, it's a bit unclear if he had to actually, if the Marian Fathers ended up making him reject all the Mariavite doctrines. I don't know, but it is just something to consider that there seems to be a lot of fluidity between the secular world or heretical sects and the Marian Fathers, and I think this kind of comes into the ecumenism that's occurring in Poland at the time. So now we have 1917. Father Honorak Kaminsky, he actually dies in 1916, but he did provide the advice to Joseph Jarbowski that he should join the Marian Fathers, and then he enters the Marian Fathers in 1917. Sister Faustina, 1924, enters the convent in Warsaw. Again, we have another claim that another new constitution by the Marian Fathers was approved again by Pope Pius, by Pope personally by himself. But again, it's all kind of secret. We'd need to see if that actually came, if something came from the Holy Office, or whether it's another claim. And then it's at this time that Sister Faustina starts receiving her first revelations from the Sisters of Mercy in Plock. So this is, again, attached to, they were started up by Father Honorak Kaminsky, that again is attached to the Mariavites. So then we move into 1934. So she starts having a revelation. She meets Father Sapako, and he tells her to start writing her, to write these things down. And allegedly, she already has a vision about this image. And so Father Sapako gets his roommate, Eugene Kazimierowski, to make the first Divine Mercy painting, and it's finished. And Father Sapako would pose as Jesus to help out with the painting. And then it's very interesting. So we already have several years of Sister Faustina having these visions. She's writing her diary, and the painting gets finished. And then she ends up burning her diary, allegedly due to thinking that she comes under, that they're all coming from Satan. And I'd point out to a lot of these, to people to consider, is that, with the way this is going, with the, you'll see in the story, is this an explanation? Did she really have these thoughts, or is this an explanation that's being given to be an opportunity to rewrite the diary, to update something going forward, So we don't have the original stuff from 1934. So if you go into her diary, you'll see writings that say 1933 and all this sort of stuff. You need to remember that that's actually being written, that's being redacted from the future back onto the past. And looking at her diary, it doesn't explain in her own words the reason for rewriting the diary at the beginning, which is what you would kind of expect if she burned it and she was starting all over again. You would think the first writings would be about her actual, being told that she has to rewrite the diary, and the reason for it, and then goes into everything. But it starts with some poems, and then it goes into an autobiography. So it seems very strange compared to what you would think the setup for a diary should be. Really, it should be, if it's an authentic diary, it should be quite sequential. And I point this out as well too, that this can seem like creeping liturgical novelty, as well as a bit of ecumenism. So she attends a spiritual retreat. Her and her convent sisters go to a spiritual retreat and receive communion under both species by a Jesuit priest. And I point this out only because at the time, again, by this time, the Mariavites, they're receiving communion under both species, and At this time, after the blessed the little mother that started the Mariavites, she died quite some time ago at this point, and so they lost a lot of followers, and they ended up coming back into the Catholic Church. So again, do you see that this is kind of a compromise to make them feel welcome at this time? And then also in 1935, we have the first Divine Mercy painting publicly displayed, but there's no mention of Sister Faustina being the originator. So this is just Father Sopoćko. There's no approval from the bishops, from his bishop, and he publicly exposes it allegedly for veneration. This is the only image on the left that the Marian Fathers will claim that shows the image being displayed, but it's really difficult. It's in the back there where you see the archway. Above the archway, there's there's a picture of Our Lady there, the famous picture of Our Lady, and then allegedly is displaying the Divine Mercy image beside it. And then it goes up into St. Michael's Church in Vilnius. And so again, it's just sort of quietly done. When you separate out the storylines, is what's actually happening is throughout the 1930s, nobody really knows that all this, these paintings are happening by, because of the visions of a nun. They're showing up in churches and as artwork, and as James said, there can be a bit of a Polish nationalist sentiment to it, and that's why this could be spreading, is to sort of have a picture of our Lord sort of attached with the Polish flag. So during the 1930s, again, so he's not letting anyone know that that Sister Faustina's visions are that his ideas for a feast of mercy are coming from Sister Faustina's alleged visions. He's writing his own essays, and I found essays in 1947, so 10 years later. He's writing about the need for a feast of mercy, but he makes no mention of this being because it's an instruction by Sister Faustina having visions of it. It's just purely his own theological writings. But at this time, the Holy Office issues a ban on bishops approving any new devotions throughout the whole church. And I think this is very critical, because you'll see going forward disobedience from priests and the hierarchy that don't seem to be putting a stop to it. They put a stop in Poland, but in America, it's allowed to take off. So the Polish bishops, they're enforcing the Holy Office ban by rejecting his request for a feast of dedication to God's divine mercy. I will say that I do find in other writings in the research as well too that the Polish hierarchy are also supportive of the devotions, and this is what I'm sort of finding with the Divine Mercy promoters, is that they sometimes play both sides, because they want to either try to show that the church is rejecting God's divine mercy essentially, and then others are trying to show how popular it was and that it was spreading, where I think people didn't really seem to know what was happening in the 1930s at the time. It was really a picture was showing up. There was there maybe was some novenas and prayer cards floating around, but there was nothing really theological being spread to the laity to connect it to any visions. So we have in 1938, Sister Faustina passes away from tuberculosis. Father Michael Sopoćko travels to Rome and tries to have an audience with Pope Pius XII to seek approval for a feast. So again, his focus is on the feast. Like that's really the thing that he wants to get established. He doesn't meet with Pope Pius XII, but the Congregation of Religious Functions says, and this is what I found very interesting, is that there's no tradition in the church of actually having any feasts and devotions to, and maybe it's not devotions, but feasts to the divine virtues and attributes of God. That if you're worshiping God and honoring God, you're honoring the person, the person of God, not the attributes, because there could be an infinite number of attributes. I know the church does discuss the divine attributes of God in human terms, that we have to quantify some of them, but my understanding theologically is that this introduces it violates the divine simplicity in the Godhead, and it makes for complexity, and that is concerning in that it leads to you're dividing up God, and it's becoming more of a polytheistic view of the Godhead. So again, after Father Spoko gets back from the Vatican, Polish primate for the primate for Poland, August Holland, again he says that the church can't approve any feast of divine mercy. So we see this repeatedly coming up, by the Polish hierarchy, not to, that this can't be banned, or so that this can't be approved. Now, to get the devotion from America and why it spread to America so popularly, I do have to go into a little bit of what was happening in World War II, because this is where we see a real change in the church, at least in America, or at least a very large expression of more of Americanism, and that's more accommodating to the secular world. So basically, World War II breaks out, and the Polish clergy, I found in doing some other research on World War II history from the Catholic Church, from what was happening with the Catholic Church, is that the Polish clergy were immediately starting to put out reports of persecution by the Germans against the church, and so again I found stories in the newspaper that Father Kolbe's, St. Maximilian Kolbe's City of the Immaculate was bombed, that the children hiding out in the monastery, they were machine gunned by German fighter planes. The monastery was turned into a concentration camp, and that Catholic universities across Poland were being bombed completely to the ground. Again, that's perpetuating the Poland crucified narrative that's going to come about. And I've looked into these, into the history of St. Maximilian Kolbe and the City of the Immaculate, and none of this actually happened in their writings now. None of this happened, but this was all being put out in the media at the time. So Americans and people in the English-speaking world, just Catholics, just saw the Germans just going after the Catholic Church like it was like they were pagans, basically, and it seems to be an exaggeration when as they go. Not saying that there wasn't any problems, it was a wartime and a lot of things, but I'm just finding out that there was a lot of false claims being made during this time, and then it's in 1940 that in a homily at a church that he first starts to reveal that his writings about a feast of mercy were connected to Sister Faustina. And just a little bit more background, we see the ecumenical movement gathering up. We obviously, I'm sure you guys are well aware of what's happening in America, that happened in America with it, but in Poland, the same thing is occurring. So under wartime, they're basically kind of, collaborating together, to provide a united front. And what people should be aware of is that, they joined the World Council of Churches, which is actually, it's funded by the Rockefeller Center, and also has close ties with the Freemasons as well too, and as well as the Soviets. And it's not directly tied to the Catholic Church, but it does just add into the milieu of that Poland was quite a complex country during this period. In America and Great Britain, we have an announcement from Churchill's government that the post-war New World Order will be pledged to the Jews. I haven't posted the whole article. If people are interested in the whole article, I'll definitely provide that as in sort of a separate document. But essentially, what you'll find is it's basically allowing Jews to have complete freedom within Western countries to basically pretty much set political narratives to make sure that they never get oppressed again. So whatever Jews say pretty much goes. And then you actually have the Vatican in a report, they saying that the Vatican condemned the sort of the secularism of the post-war New World Order plans by the British and the Americans. So now we get to 1941, and this is when the Divine Mercy spreads from Poland to America. So Father Jarzbowski, he flees. We're being told by the Marian Fathers that he's fleeing as a refugee with just the shirt on his back, because essentially the Nazis are persecuting him because of the devotion. They're attaching the reason for him needing to flee to the Nazis being anti-Catholic, but in fact it's because he's working with the Polish underground. Poland's actually allied with the Russians at this stage, so the Marian Fathers will also say that he was fleeing the communists, but if you look at the timeline, he flees across Russia to get to America, and so it's hard to believe that he was traveling across Russia if he was trying to escape the communists. And obviously, if Russia is allied with America, then you would understand that there's no problem with this travel route. And the other thing is, they make it sound like he's escaping just with a shirt on his back, but actually the devotion isn't the main thing that he's escaping with. He's actually escaping with a lot of Polish historical documents and revolutionary artifacts, and he starts up a museum. I'm not too sure what sort of documents that he has that is causing him to need to flee the Germans, because while there were priests put into concentration camps, about 90% of the clergy were not, from my gathering. So there needs to be a deeper look than just that he was fleeing because of the Catholic faith, but the Poles and the Marian Fathers will want you to think it that way, and this is how he becomes the Apostle of Mercy, and this is where we get the British and American. We come to 1943 in the war, and the British and Catholic hierarchy ignore the Vatican's rejection of the post-war New Order plans. They signed a joint declaration with Protestant and Jewish organizations, essentially to defend religious freedom, religious equality, and equality for minorities. And equality for minorities, we would tend to think of as racial equality, but really it leaves it open to basically governments declaring, cutting up a population any which way to create minorities and cause further division. So I just point out that I think this is a clear position where a clear signal where the Catholic hierarchies, in the English-speaking world, kind of abandoned its feeling of it having a missionary role and for religious indifferentism. And while there's a long list that I've highlighted in red on the right, I just point out some notable people. You'll probably, if I can send this to you a blown up version, and you can read some of the names. You might recognize some more of the names. But Archbishop Edward Mooney of Detroit, so he's head of the Catholic National Welfare Conference. He would approve some of the first Divine Mercy prayer cards in America. Just as note, Fulton J. Sheen put his name to this list, and he was he was popular at the time, and he was working at the Washington Catholic University, which is actually also where one of the Marian houses is at. I'm not too sure if Fulton Sheen has a connection to the Divine Mercy, but he would probably know about it because there's quite a large building for the Marian Fathers there. And again, just as a note too, just the president of Notre Dame, like another prominent Catholic university, signed up onto this declaration as well. So this is where you'll see, moving into the post-war era, essentially a lot of religious indifferentism spreading before you get to Vatican II. So this is where we get into the second Divine Mercy painting being painted. So this is after Faustina dies. So she's been dead, she passed away quite some time ago. And it's just to point out that this is happening in Krakow under the Germans, and the image is kept private. So again, nobody's really seen this. This is all an agreement between Faustina's convent, Adolf Hila, and Joseph Andre is really that this happens. And it's interesting just to note that there must be, that this didn't come out of nowhere, that there must have been previous sketches quite some time before this that looked like this second image compared to the image that was painted by that artist Eugene. And so 1944, this is the earliest. There could be earlier devotional cards, but again, this is where I'm highlighting Archbishop Edward Mooney would sign the first imprimaturs for the prayer cards for Divine Mercy. And it's, again, just to remind you, this is happening again after the Vatican had banned all new devotions. They're still spreading it. And here we have an archbishop that he's promoting it. And by the very fact that this is happening in America during the war means that he could not have, that there had to be sketches happening, far ahead, like basically back when Father Joseph Jarbowski came to America, there must have been sketches for this second image that was being considered. So I think that from what I'm finding from the research is that there was a lot of these merciful, basically they're called the merciful savior images, various different types. And I think it again attaches to the Polish nationalism. You have one from the north, and then you have one from the south, the Lithuanian part and the Polish part. We get near to the end of the war, and Father Joseph Jarbowski makes, from what I can see, it seems like the first public announcement that there is a Divine Mercy devotion attached to revelations of Sister Faustina having a diary, and he presents it as a miracle of saving Vilnius and Krakow from being destroyed by the Nazis. That this claim of a miracle is basically based on Russian propaganda at the time, and that there's no plans really to touch Krakow. And again, I just keep highlighting out, this is being publicly promoted by the Marian Fathers, and yet the devotions are still been banned since 1937. And I also point out this as well too, is that having this miracle of saved cities helps to cover up any of the false stories that people may have read about the Catholic Church being persecuted. And I think this is something we have to consider going forward. And if people are interested in World War II, is to try to get a level-headed understanding of what exactly was happening, and separating out atrocity propaganda that was used to gain war support versus what was actually happening. Again, I'm pointing out in the publicly, the American Catholic press, they claim that the Polish bishops approved of Feast of Mercy of God based on Sister Faustina, but again, I'll be pointing out later that still in the 1950s, the Polish bishops reject having a feast. So I think that this is, it seems like this is just coming out of Stockbridge, their headquarters. And again, we see the ecumenical movement moving along. There was a meeting in Seelisberg, and this has kind of gotten lost into the annals of history, that basically Catholic clergy, Protestants meet with Jewish scholars to agree to use their authority within their churches to reinterpret scripture and suppress anything that that is critical of the Jews in the New Testament. And one thing I sort of found that it in their writings about this meeting is that is how important that multiculturalism is into curbing quote unquote anti-Semitism and basically sort of reducing sort of the sovereignty of nations to deal with this. And it's a bit of a side thing, but they do mention that in some of their writings. Okay, so we do have in the 1950s, it's claimed that the Polish people in Poland are trying to open up the beatification process, and that the Marian Fathers are continuing to promote the devotion of divine mercy. They're no longer talking about it saving Polish cities from World War II, but in this article on the left, it tries to say that Sister Faustina's diary had warnings about a World War III between America and Russia, and basically at this time you had the fear of nuclear annihilation. But I think it's interesting to remember as well too, at this time there's no public diary. It's not there. The Stockbridge is not selling they're not selling copies of the diary, telling people to read the diary. They're giving nuggets of information and attaching it to what the politics is happening at the time, especially it seems like with America. And I'll just point out with this last image here, we have basically a different image, Divine Mercy image, and that's celebrating the Feast of Mercy in America, and this is still banned. But we have a different, this is a third image that comes out of the Divine Mercy promoters, which again is kind of strange that they're using this image and not the one that Hila did, if that's the first one they used, or the original one that Eugene did, because they would have had sketches from the original person, from the original painter. Again, I'm just pointing out here with the ecumenism that there's a big promotion called Brotherhood Week in America between Protestants, Freemasons, Jews, with the American government. And again, there was basically the big promotion to stop being bigots to one another, to be accommodating to one another. Bishops were speaking at Masonic lodges and getting awards from B'nai B'rith, and they're having all these sort of breakfasts and everything happening through the 1950s. So I just sort of point this out that I think this is how the Divine Mercy started to become quite prominent, in that as the Catholic Church stopped seeing itself as needing to convert people, the idea was, that if you're actively going out trying to convert people, well, you're really not trusting in God's mercy, and they sort of start to create a deformed view of God's divine mercy, and I don't think the average Catholic has a deformed view of God's divine mercy, or basically the spiritual and corporal works of mercy. But I think they're trying to move the Catholic mind onto more of a faith alone belief system, similar to the Protestants. So again, even though the media was saying that the Polish bishops approved a Feast of Divine Mercy, we found out the Polish bishop says it gives a negative judgment of Divine Mercy. Then we have 1958. Many people have read that the Holy Office encouraged the suppression of the devotion. Then they came out very publicly with a declaration prohibiting the spread of Sister Faustina's Revelations, feast, and images. And yet, despite the 1937 ban on new devotions, and despite these other negative judgments, while it does go into suppression, the Marian Fathers of Stockbridge, they still clandestinely keep the Divine Mercy revelation alive by just calling it the mercy of God and not mentioning Sister Faustina's Revelations. 1963, they open a shrine to the mercy of God, and then now that's known in Stockbridge now as the national shrine of the Divine Mercy. So I've just done a newspaper clipping from 1963 when it was being consecrated by the bishop. and then just a modern photo today. And then in 1966, you have Sister Faustina's convent and priests that are devoted to her transfer her remains from the cemetery to the chapel. And I'm not too sure if this is a serious concern. That's something I'd have to leave it up to the learned men of the society to the fathers of the society to let us know. Is that an issue to, is that a step too far in if someone hasn't been beatified yet to actually move the remains to be used for veneration before anything's been declared. Then we have the 1970s. This is where they're trying to review the devotion, and it's just Karol Wojtyla, the future John Paul II. He gets this Polish scholar to review it, and gives his theological stamp of approval on it. And again, there's various manuscripts that they compile together. They claim that it's based on, that the ban was based on a faulty translation. But there's quite a few different papers. It's not sort of one book or books. There's a bunch of pages. And it's just to point out the theological background of this Father Ignatius Rosiski, is that he helped craft the Vatican II documents on religious freedom in the church in the modern world. And then so Pope John Paul comes in, and he makes a big connection to the Holocaust. He has the ban lifted, and he is central really to fomenting in the modern era the Poland crucified, and he's with the Poland resurrected. And this is where we get the Divine Mercy gets attached to the Poland resurrected narrative. So we have, with the Holocaust and Auschwitz, Poland crucified, and then you have, I found this picture of Pope John Paul II with his arms outstretched, all by himself in Victory Square of Warsaw, and he's waiting for a plane to take a helicopter to take him up into the air, and so the Divine Mercy, obviously, Poland suffered this tragedy, and a lot of people have been reading all these tragic stories, some probably true and some probably false, but then Poland now gets to look merciful after all this tragedy, after this tragedy. And so I just point out here, just in terms of some of the stories, I found this quote from a Polish communist, that is admitting that a lot of the writings of the terrible things happening at Auschwitz, where it was actually propaganda put out by the communists, and they did it to the very end. And just at this time, for the context of Americans, just when John Paul II becomes Pope, we actually do have the Holocaust theme, our modern understanding of the Holocaust, come about in 1978. That wasn't really used. The term Holocaust wasn't really used. There was no real concept of it in terms of the narrative. And there was a television show that was called The Holocaust that was put out in America and Germany, and then that's where everything starts to cement. So that comes out at the same time with that, the public would be ready to see. We move into the 1980s, and again, we have the public, being told lots of stories about the suffering of Poland. 1987 sort of seems to be the big year that the Divine Mercy is officially unveiled to the public with an overarching narrative. John Paul II and the Marian Fathers work with Hollywood, Jews and Protestants to produce this movie called Divine Mercy No Escape, to explain Divine Mercy to the public. And then this is where actually the English version of the diary is finally revealed to the English speaking public. No longer is, when you watch the movie, no longer is the Divine Mercy attached to any miracles of saving Polish cities or about a third world war and nuclear annihilation, but connects the devotion to the Holocaust. The movie implies that the devotion saved lives during the Holocaust. That could be true or not, but it's basically it's trying to attach itself to the Holocaust, with the implication that the Jews that are participating in the movie, that that this must be inspiring a big conversion of Jews to the church, that who had lost their faith in God, because that's what you see at the beginning of the movie. And one of the interesting things to point out in the movie is that it makes this really bold claim that if you pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet, Jesus will basically grant you anything you wish for, which is from my understanding, is a very un-Catholic concept. I mean, it's basically turning our Lord and Savior like a genie that just sort of does whatever we ask for, and forgetting that that what we ask for has to be within God's will for us. So to now clean up things for Sister Faustina's beatification, we have to the Church has to fix the controversial aspects of the Marian Fathers and the Polish and the Polish priests that were involved with the spread of the devotion and the reputations. So we first have John Paul II beatifying Blessed George, the founder of the new Mariavite, the new Marian Fathers. He beatifies Honorak Kaminsky, and now in 1993 he beatifies Sister Faustina. And then after that, during his beatification of the 108 Polish martyrs from World War II, two of them are part of the Marian Fathers of the Immaculate Conception, and again, it's to reinforce that Poland crucified narrative, all the martyrs, but also the Marian Fathers, really. And their story is that they were burned alive by the Germans. And it should be pointed out, a lot of the deaths that he notes as martyrs were actually, you look into the stories, they actually died of typhus and other wartime diseases. So anyway, they make it. Then again, this is where the Poles confuse being Polish with being Catholic, because when you look into their stories, the two Marian priests, they're actually admitted political partisans. So now, again, this is where things start to become clouded as well. Were they killed for being Catholic, or were they being killed for political activities? And so I'm just pointing out that they were political partisans. And the thing is in, now I understand that the Catholic Church is above any sort of human laws, but it is a violation of the Hague Convention to be a political partisan during the war, that you actually have to, you can't basically be, you basically have to join a visible army. You can't sort of be, you can't be using your clerical collar. You can't be, or if you are a priest, you have to be a chaplain, and I just point out that, from the research that, while some priests were taken into concentration camps, a lot of areas were still remained running throughout the war that were under German occupation. So Kolbe's City of the Immaculate was opened, and there was actually German soldiers doing security for it, and the cathedral in Krakow was actually still operated throughout the war. So then we get to 2000, and Sister Faustina is finally canonized by Pope John Paul II. And I've just put here that, as now we're sort of at the end of how she gets canonized. We have the merciful God attached with, merciful Poland that is now resurrected. We have the merciful, quote unquote, merciful post-conciliar church that is putting behind animosities towards the heresies of, what the church said were the enemies of the church in the past. And none of the stories used to promote the devotion are mentioned anymore by the Marian Fathers of the Immaculate Conception. So I just showed some images here to point out the Divine Mercy, the resurrected Poland of, we have the sanctuaries of Divine Mercy. You find others throughout Poland. Father Joseph Jarzbowski, his reputation is elevated in that he has a museum at this basilica that was constructed in 2010. You've got sanctuaries to Pope John Paul, and then a statue of him doing the outstretched arms like he was at Victory Square in Warsaw, which is some powerful symbolism for the resurrected Poland. And that would bring me to the end of my presentation.
Again, I know it's a bit long, but this is definitely information that no one has ever looked into Divine Mercy before. I mean, there's a huge conflict with also with how the enemies were able to, as you could see, how they're able to slipstream this devotion while leveraging, basically they're ignoring the Holy See the whole time and basically pushing this devotion, hoping people would recognize it. And but we do thank our Blessed Mother, especially Our Lady of Fatima. Pray for us for helping us with this effort. And you'll find out in the next presentation the works of Great Mercy. It's going to be out of scope of this project, so we're still discerning if that's an effort that we still want to go down due to the spiritual risk, especially one of our team members. So please keep her in your rosary. So now we're at the very conclusion over here. So now everyone had a chance to understand the history of Poland, how Polish Messianism, how the sense of Polish nationalism was potentially used to promote this devotion, and how this devotion actually snuck through the system per se. I mean, basically, you can see that the Holy See already said no new devotions for a reason. It's been forbidden by the Holy See as well. So one thing to note here is Pope Leo XIII said the worst kind of heretic is the one who, while teaching mostly true Catholic doctrine, add a word of heresy like a drop of poison in a cup of water. And we know today, Vatican II, Novus Ordo, it's exactly that. So modernism, it's, open quote, the effort of its proponents to harmonize traditional Catholic doctrine with the new philosophy and modern biblical criticism, from Father Dominic Gourmaud's book, 100 Years of Modernism, Reconciate Pace. So going back to Our Lady of Good Success, quote unquote, from God the Father to the Venerable Sister Mariana de Jesus Torres back in the 17th century, my justice will be tried to the limit by the evils and sacrilegious of this 20th century. I shall punish heresy, blasphemy, and impurity. And we definitely know what the heresy is. It is the heresy of modernism that has enveloped the entire church, as we could see today. So the Holy Office made a decree that new forms of worship and devotion on the useless imitations of corruptions of similar ones which are already established, such as the devotion to the Sacred Heart. That's from AS-29, page 304. That was back in May 26, 1937. So you probably never heard of these devotions before, but you'll see devotion to the Sacred Head of our Lord, devotion to the annihilated love of Jesus, the Rosary of the Most Sacred Wounds of our Lord, devotion to the merciful love of Jesus, and the Holy See forbid this holy wounds devotion by Sister Mary Martha Schambone, because it was already there was already a devotion towards the 5 wounds of our Lord Jesus Christ that's typically recited during Holy Hour. So AS 51-271, the Supreme Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office, having examined the alleged visions and the revelations of Sister Faustina Kowalska of the Institute of Our Lady of Mercy, who died in 1938 near Krakow, has decreed as follows. The distribution of pictures and writings which present the devotion to the Divine Mercy in the forms proposed by this Sister Faustina should be forbidden. This, what the Holy See has said in AS 51, page 271, basically, this is why the Holy See saw something wrong with the devotion. And obviously, with Novus Ordo and Vatican II, all of a sudden it's been lifted. It's been reinstated by Pope John Paul II. So it was Carlo Ottaviani, who was the head of the Holy Office in 1959, when it issued a notification forbidding the distribution of images and writings that promote devotion to Divine Mercy in the forms proposed by Sister Faustina. So everyone knows who this good cardinal is. He stood up, and he's definitely a holy man to be trusted. So here's an excerpt from Diary 1582. So, quote, "And when I stand at the foot of your throne, that will not be an obstacle to my returning to earth to encourage souls and incite them to trust in God's mercy. Indeed, this immersion in God will give me the possibility of boundless action." Well, this is going into presumption of God's mercy. So here is considered a vice opposed to the theological virtue of hope. It may also be regarded as a product of pride. It may be defined as a condition of a soul which, because of a badly regulated reliance on God's mercy and power, hopes for salvation without doing anything to deserve it, or for pardon of his sins without repenting of them. We have another one, and it's from her note in her diary, 1653. "And I sense my eternal destiny in heaven." Now, from the Philippians chapter 2, verse 12, "With fear and trembling work out of your salvation," right? So, yes, we must have the holy fear of God in us. And even Bishop Richard Schaloner said, "This is against the false faith and presumptuous security of modern sectaries." And another one from the diary. Diary note 374. "I heard this voice of my soul. From today on, do not fear God's judgment, for you will not be judged." Well, in the second letter of St. Paul to Corinthians, chapter 5, verse 10, for we must all be manifested before the judgment seat of Christ, every one of us, that everyone may receive the proper things of the body according as he hath done, whether it be good or evil. Close quote. And in entry number 420 of the diary, "Every soul believing and trusting in my mercy will obtain it." Well, if you see faith over here, faith is synonymous to trust and belief. So it's going to faith alone, right? Faith alone will save you. Well, James chapter 2, verse 20 says, "But wilt thou know, O vain man, that faith without works is dead." And again, Council of Trent, Canon 9, If anyone saith that by faith alone the impious is justified, in such wise as to mean that nothing else is required to cooperate in order to obtaining the grace of justification, and that it is not in any way necessary that he be prepared and disposed by the movement of his own will, let him be anathema. And another note, but again, folks, there's a lot of them. I just can't. It just this presentation will go on for another hour and a half. If I enumerated all the questionable entries in her diary. So entry 378. But God has promised a great grace, especially to you and to all those who will proclaim my great mercy. I shall protect them myself at the hour of death as my own glory. Well, Catechism and Trent says, open quote, no one who has arrived at the use of reason can be justified unless he is resolved to keep all of God's commandments. Contradiction. Diary 678. Once I was going down the hall to the kitchen. I heard these words in my soul, say in seasoning the chaplet that I have taught you, whoever will recite it will receive great mercy at the hour of death. And priests will recommend it to sinners as their last hope of salvation. Well, Catechism and Trent says, the sacrament of extreme unction, which by the fathers was regarded as being the completion not only of penance, but also of the whole Christian life. This sacred unction of the sick was instituted by Christ our Lord as truly and properly a sacrament of the new law, insinuated indeed in Mark, but recommended and promulgated to the faithful by James the Apostle and brother of the Lord. Close quote. And in entry 707, I suddenly saw the Lord Jesus who spoke these words to me. That is why I am uniting myself with you so intimately as with no other creature. Well, from Ad Caelo Reginam, Pope Pius XII, it cannot be doubted that Mary Most Holy is far above all of the creatures in dignity. And after her son primacy over all, you have surpassed every creature, sings Saint Sophronius. What can be more sublime than your joy, O Virgin Mother? What more noble than this grace which you alone have received from God? To this Saint Germanus adds, your honor and dignity surpass the whole of creation. Your greatness places you above the angels. And the Saint John Damascene goes so far as to say, limitless is the difference between God's servants and his mother. Close quote. And in diary, note 44, where this obviously is a subliminal to okay communion in the hands. So, open quote. And the host came out of the tabernacle and came to rest in my hands. And I, with joy, placed it back in the tabernacle. This was repeated a second time, and I did the same thing. Despite this, it happened a third time. Only consecrated hands are to touch the sacred specimen, right? And another one from 160, note 160. When the priest approached me again, I raised the host for him to put back into the chalice, because when I had first received Jesus, I could not speak before consuming the host, and so could not tell him that the other host had fallen. But while I was holding the host in my hand, I felt such a power of love that for the rest of the day I could neither eat nor come to my senses. I heard these words from the host, I desired to rest in your hands, not only in your heart. Wow. You know, it makes me feel good about receiving our Lord in our hands, right? And that is it. That is the end of this presentation. So we're still discerning if we're going to have a sequel to this, and it's still debated if we want to go deeper into the writings of the Mariavites in this correlation. There are suspect of parallels between the diocese of Faustina and the literature of the works of Great Mercy by the Mariavites. So I'd like to thank you all for your attendance and for your support.